The Middle East, long an arena for competing world powers, but 2015 was the year the region's conflicts went truly global. What's changing? Who's pulling the strings? And where are things headed in 2016? The Middle East in review. This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. Welcome to a special edition of Inside Story looking at the Middle East in 2015. The region, with its overlapping rivalries and conflicts, it's kind of like a giant game of 3D chess. Think multiple boards and pieces, complicated strategies, and quite frankly, the rules changing all the time. But even that metaphor falls short in describing just how complex it got this year. Think of Syria alone. The war entered its fourth year and became a theatre for some of the world's biggest powers, chief among them Russia and the United States, but all with very different visions of how to solve this crisis. But really, how do you even think about solving something which is so complicated? Here's another metaphor, a spider's web, as illustrated so well in this graphic by David McCandless at Information is Beautiful. You've got there the players that hate each other, then the ones with the complicated relationship, then the ones decent enough ties, and then the ones who are close allies. What we've created here is a complicated, tangled web. It is interconnected in ways which are almost impossible to count. And what makes it worse is the way that, with the uprisings of 2011, state systems in the Middle East and North Africa really started to disintegrate. Here's our map of the region. The obvious place to start right now is Syria and Iraq. Large parts of both countries dismembered by years of war and, of course, more recently by the advance of ISIL. In fact, really, the border separating Iraq and Syria doesn't exist now. Further south in Yemen, a Saudi-led coalition is at war with Houthi fighters and the state has collapsed there. So too in Libya, where some members of the rival factions recently signed a very fragile UN-backed peace agreement. Neighbouring Tunisia has avoided the bloodshed but is still dealing with a difficult political transition. And Egypt, well, has taken a very different route. It now has a military-led government with many opposition figures still in prison. So much for us to talk about today, and here is our panel, starting in London with Yazid Saeed, who's the Senior Associate at the Carnegie Middle East Centre. In Washington, D.C. is Shibli Telhami, is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland. And also in London, Anthony Dworkin, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. We welcome all of you to Inside Story today. I'm going to start with ISIL, because I think the key thing, if we're looking at 2015 as a whole, 1 year ago we didn't have ISIL and now we do, and that has changed pretty much everything. Yazid Saeed, let's start with you.
Well, I don't think that anything fundamental has changed with ISIL, either in terms of its ability, its reach, or of the fight against it. The real drama, of course, was in 2014 when it erupted in the north of Iraq and drove all the way down from Mosul to Baghdad and basically combined the areas it controlled inside Syria with those it controlled inside Iraq. I think what is interesting about ISIL, I guess, for your viewers, is the perception that with the attacks in Sinai, the bombing of the Russian jet, the attacks in Beirut suburbs, and with, of course, the Paris attacks, that somehow ISIL has gone global, and that this could be a significant transformation. I do, however, think that is something of a red herring.
I guess this is what I was more focusing on, the fact the way ISIL has changed. In fact, a report from IHS Janes, which just came out today, saying ISIL has lost 14% of its so-called caliphate territory in 2015. I mean, you could look at that and say, well, that's a win. They're getting smaller. But when they're attacking in Beirut and Paris, I mean, the point is moot almost, isn't it?
It's partly moot because a lot of the talk about percentages of territory held by ISIL, by the Baghdad government, by the Assad government in Syria or his opposition, a lot of this is playing with figures because a lot of the time, take Syria, the regime, the Assad regime, controls 60, maybe 70% of the population and of the main population centers, and then the fact that it doesn't control very large areas of desert land is frankly immaterial. And so I think, there's a lot of PR here. Government spokespersons and so on want to show that they're making progress against ISIL in Iraq. There is progress, definitely. And I think actually that is still the more important development than the fact that supporters of ISIL have taken it upon themselves, be it in Sinai in Egypt, be it in Beirut, be it in Paris, to carry out attacks, possibly with its direct support, but nonetheless, ISIS remains fundamentally an Iraqi organization based in northern Iraq and Sunni provinces and in eastern parts of Syria. Defeated there, and I think you have broken the phenomenon. The rest are franchises, whether they're in Libya or elsewhere, and we, I think, need to be able to distinguish when we look at it between the actions of those sympathizers around the world who are operating in their own societies and carry the name. They might have carried the name McDonald's or Al-Qaeda or whatever, but they've chosen ISIL. But ISIL as an organization is unlike Al-Qaeda, which is more of a transnational network. ISIL is very much still an Iraqi thing.
Okay. Shibli Tilhami, let me bring you into the conversation, because what ISIL has managed to do this year, intentionally otherwise, is draw the West back into the region, back into the Middle East. Right. Do you think the West, are actually making progress, as Yazid was talking about, take them out in Iraq and Syria and you could actually make a difference? Do you believe the West is actually getting there?
Well, actually, at some level, at the level of policymakers, certainly in Washington and many European capitals, people don't disagree much with what Yazid has said, meaning that they don't really see it necessarily as such a global threat, but it has emerged such a global threat in the perception of the populace, and therefore they are forced to react in a way that they didn't before. So whether or not it has the capacity to sustain a global fight is almost immaterial in terms of the perception, because the perception now is that it is global. It certainly has changed the agenda within the U.S., it changed the debate. But contributing to that, I may add, is something else that we have lost sight of. Yet a year ago, the focal point was Iran, and here certainly in the U.S. and much of the West, that was taking the attention, it was superseding the story about ISIL. ISIL was still in the news. The beheadings, people thought of it as, regional threat and an important one, but it wasn't the top of the priorities. Iran was the top of the priorities. So the Iran agreement has really elevated ISIL in the perception of the West, particularly in the U.S., and you could see that in our presidential debates, particularly among Republicans, in addition to the bombings that it had undertaken that brought that to the fore. And therefore, right now, it is certainly part and parcel of the conversation in the West, and certainly within the presidential debates in the U.S., and I think it's likely to remain so all the way through the American election.
And we're going to come back to Iran a little bit later on in the program. I might just bring Anthony Dworkin in at this stage as well. Hello to you. The other thing which ISIL has done is create proxy battles. You've got the Saudi versus Iran. You've got the Turkey versus Russia. The shooting down of the Russian plane is a classic example of that. Almost to the point where those proxy battles became the news, or they became the big feature ahead of the actual ISIL problem, if you want to call it that.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, I think essentially we have overlapping layers of conflict. You have these internal conflicts within Syria, within Yemen, within Libya. And then on top of that, you have ISIS, which is often interposing itself and taking advantage of the space that's being created to expand out of its core region. And then on top of that, you have the third dimension, which is these proxy battles of regional and international powers who are then coming in on top of that. And I think one of the things that's become very clear over the course of the year is that the problem has to be addressed at all levels. It's important to try and get the regional players and the international players aligned, but that's only going to work if you can solve the situation on the ground as well. And to me, the story of this year, I think we have seen from a European perspective a lot more attention to ISIS and to the terrorist threat, and perhaps a tendency in some European countries to start prioritizing the threat and the potential military response to it, and perhaps too much taking the organization at its word to see the links between ISIS in Libya and Syria and potentially in Sinai in Egypt as well, and to look at prioritize the military response to that. And I think it's very important not to lose sight of the distinctive particularities of each country if we're going to respond to that. So if you look at Libya, the danger now is that we're trying to accelerate a political solution in Libya that doesn't really have local grounding, simply because that will give us a green light to then be able to go in and use military action against ISIS before it establishes itself too strongly.
You know, something that strikes me there as you talk about all these different countries, about the different regions, about the different players, is that 2015 was almost like a year of the coalition. Right? You've got the Saudi-led coalition going into Yemen. You've got the US-led coalition against ISIL, which then France took a leading role in that. And they get support from the likes of Qatar and the UAE, almost to give it a legitimacy. Well, look, Arab nations are involved as well. This is another proxy battle, isn't it? And then Saudi Arabia with its terrorist coalition or anti-terrorist coalition that it came out with. It's like they're all trying to show we're the leaders and we're the ones who are taking control here. And in effect, no one is in the end. How about I put this to you, Shibli?
Well, I think, yes, there is truth to that, the external intervention side. But what I want to say about that is that while it's true that you have layering of the problem, whether it's in Syria or Libya or Yemen, you have a local problem that's real and no one can avoid that. And ultimately, you need to address it. But frankly, the international intervention is not just a sideshow. And it is, in some ways, I think, trumps even the local problems. In fact, I would argue that more than 50% of the problem in Syria is external intervention. And it's not a coincidence, in my own view. If you look at the countries, you started off in your introduction about the states that are falling apart. I call them the Humpty Dumpty states that might be difficult to put back together, whether it's Iraq, Syria, Libya, and so forth. And those are the places where we had the most intervention, starting with Iraq, obviously, which is the American-led intervention led to what we have there. Syria, there's too much intervention, not too little intervention. And so for me, if I'm going to say, how do we address with the Syrian crisis, I would say the first thing you have to do is find some coordination among the international parties, because otherwise there's no opportunity for it on the inside. So the international issue is huge. And I think the Russian intervention, specifically in Syria, in odd ways, opens up an opportunity, not so much because Russia wants a deal. Russia's got its own strategic issues, but because, frankly, it makes it easier for the U.S. To swallow the Syrian army continued existence. That's been the internal decision anyway within the Obama administration, but not the public view of it. And it's much easier for the U.S. to deal with Russia than it is to deal with Iran. It's much easier for Jordan to deal with Russia than it is to deal with Iran, and indirectly deal with Assad. So I think in some ways that's certainly the path that is required right now. Doesn't solve the problem, but it certainly lays the ground for some addressing of the local issues.
Yazid, before we leave Syria there and move on to some other issues, do you have any reason to think there could be some improvement or some breakthrough in Syria in 2016? The fact that they're trying to get talking at least?
Well, I think the Vienna statement, which for the first time brought Iran in, along with all the other key external players together, and the fact that the Vienna statement represented some level of ambiguity about the status or future status of the Syrian President Assad, has opened up a slight margin. I mean, we're talking 3%, for instance, for a meaningful political discussion to start in early 2016. There are so many obstacles in the way, however, at every step of the way, that I fear that we're likely not to see a successful process. But if I may, while I have your attention,
sure,
I want to go back to the point you made about 2015 being the year of coalitions. And I think that's a very interesting point, because maybe what's most striking about these coalitions is that they're coalitions to wage war precisely because they lack a political strategy. I mean, if you look at the Saudi intervention in Yemen, Saudi Arabia led a war because it didn't have a clear political plan for Yemen. And 8 or 9 months later, it still doesn't have a political plan and is stuck with an ongoing war. The coalition against ISIL, while entirely justified morally or even militarily, equally hasn't resolved the core problems of the failure of the Iraqi state to produce reconciliation among its citizens, among Sunnis and Shias, failed to reform itself, failed to rebuild effective public services and so on, massive poverty, massive corruption, and the reform plan launched by the Prime Minister Abadi in August, commendably, nonetheless goes nowhere near far enough to providing a framework for the type of reforms that are needed on all levels. So these are coalitions, unfortunately, that aren't centered on constructing something. They're not providing solutions. They are coalitions about fighting a war in lieu of actually dealing with the core problems, and that is very worrying. Especially as the other side of this coin, and Shibli referred to this a moment ago, is that we have now at least half a dozen Arab states in a situation of state failure. Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen are the obvious ones. Lebanon is effectively a failed state, although maybe a very positive model about one that's avoided sliding into violence. It muddles along, and there are probably one or two on the way. And the real question is, why are so many Arab states failing? And is it going to be any more a question of somehow rebuilding them more or less along the old model? Or are we past that stage? Is it impossible to rebuild a single central state of Libya or Yemen or Iraq or Syria and so on? Are we moving into something new? And what is that thing?
Gentlemen, all three of you have mentioned Iran so far in the conversation, so we better talk about Iran. Anthony, I'll start with you. The breakthrough year because we got a nuclear deal, and that was a big deal. Is it, in your mind, the real deal? Is it actually going to be, do you think the implementation is going to work and that it's going to bring Iran in from the cold?
Well, I should say that the Iran deal isn't something that I followed closely in detail. My sense of it is that the deal, as far as it goes, is significant. Clearly, there's a lot of work to do to make sure that the implementation is followed through on. But I think it's, I think it does advance significantly the search for a solution to the nuclear issue there. I think the deal is fine. I think the question that it leaves is, the more important question is, what impact that deal has on the regional alignment. Does it open up some scope? And this is something that a lot of European officials are looking at very closely for moderating Iranian behavior on other questions. And I think that so far is very much an open question. We haven't seen any clear evidence so far, but that's going to be the focus of a lot of interest over the coming year.
Shibli, this is something which I wondered in the preparation for this show, if there is always going to be some sort of inherent distrust of Iran, that everyone wants to open up and get back in there and bring it in and ease the tensions, but there will always be this element of just holding back a bit.
Well, you have to look at it in some perspective. I supported the deal because it actually makes it less likely that Iran will develop nuclear weapons, doesn't eliminate that possibility, and especially because it took off war as an option. That was certainly something that I was always worried about. The U.S. would be dragged into unnecessary war that doesn't solve the problem, makes it more complicated. It takes the war option off the table. That's a good thing. But to say that it's transformative would be to say too much. I don't think either Iran or the United States are in particularly good mood in terms of wanting to improve relations. I think the Iranians saw the deal as a way of opening up to the rest of the world, not necessarily the U.S., the Germans, the Chinese, and that they're doing. I think the Arab countries were not going to be comfortable with Iran no matter what, because the issue for them wasn't so much the nuclear issue. It was for them that Iran would be empowered politically, conventional weaponry, in a way that it would enable it to play a bigger role in the Gulf. That actually has increased. The Israelis are not comfortable with
the Israelis and
the
Saudis both will want to fuel that fire, won't they, and fuel that idea.
But not for the same reason. The Saudis' worry wasn't really so much the nuclear issue. They were worried about Iran, being accepted more, being accepted by the international community, building up its economy, developing, and becoming more meddling in Arab affairs. That's what they're worried about. The Israelis are worried about the technological edge, and they worry that Iran's technology is undermining their technological edge on which they rely heavily. And I think that hasn't been resolved by this agreement, which is why the Israelis will continue to push. And as you know, the Israeli government has not only opposed this actively, but now is probably hoping that there'll be a Republican president in the White House in 2017, and that president would be much more amenable to a different course of action on Iran.
Right, we're starting to run down the clock, and there's one more topic I want to get into, and ironically, it's the biggest issue, arguably, but it's the lowest on my list, and that is Israel-Palestine, because that is something which is, you're all nodding, it's all just muddled along in the background. There's been the stabbings that have happened in Israel and Palestine. It's been there the whole time, but no one's doing anything about it. Yazid, let's start with you. The peace process as we knew it is dead in the water at the moment. Is there any hope it could be resurrected?
Short answer, no. I think it's pretty clear now that everyone, all the key external actors who might have pushed for a resumption of the peace process or invested meaningful capital in that, the US, the European Union, even a few regional actors like, say, Saudi Arabia, have all pretty much accepted that they're not going to be able to get this going. And rather than pretend anymore, they're now becoming pretty open about abandoning the task without suggesting an alternative. That leaves us with developments on the ground. The fact that Israel continues to colonize parts of the West Bank and East Jerusalem and maintains the siege of Gaza, while at the same time trying to work with what's left of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank on security issues in order to maintain some level of peace. And I think this is basically something to watch, because what's happening is that developments on the ground among local society on both sides are partly what also is changing things. The fact that now, for 2 or 3 months we've witnessed random attacks by Palestinians on Israelis, on soldiers, shootings, and increasingly nasty settler violence by Israeli settlers against Palestinian civilians, etc. This shows a sort of more communal type of conflict, civil strife. And what is in particular interesting is that while Israel has significantly increased its incursions into Palestinian autonomous areas, but also its detentions in places like Jerusalem. Jerusalem seems to be a very significant flashpoint. 1/3 of all Palestinians arrested in the last year have been in Jerusalem, with a large number also of people under 17, minors. And so I think something is happening there.
Yazid, I'm going to jump in only just because I'm starting to run out of time. We could keep talking for hours, I'm sure, but I do want to get another thought from Anthony on this, because one of the points Yazid made was how people are admitting that the peace process is gone and that trying to resurrect it is so difficult. I think I heard the White House spokesman say as much, that President Obama doesn't think it'll happen while he's in power. Is there a European player who could step up? Can the European Union be involved? Is it Turkey, or is it the UK, or is there someone who could jump in and say, right, let's grab this by the scruff of the neck and do something about it?
Well, I think the Europeans are kind of institutionally oriented towards trying to resurrect the peace process when they can do it. And yet the degree of skepticism and cynicism across Europe about the prospects for a peace settlement, I think, are rather high at the moment. And what we're seeing in Europe is a provisional shift, I think, towards looking at other frameworks for this. We see increasingly Europeans looking at recognizing Palestine. We see increasingly the EU pushing the agenda of differentiation, that is, differentiating between products that are made in Israeli settlements, which are seen as illegitimate under European law, and products that are produced in Israel proper. So there are quite detailed and deep trade links, economic links between the EU and Israel. And I think simply following through on the course of the legal obligations there is something that we're already seeing a bit more of. And so there's, I think there's a shift towards looking at the kind of the civil rights and the legal rules that apply as things now stand, and moving away from this idea that we defer everything and prioritize the peace process.
The peace process,
I think there's,
right, yes.
There's the degree of skepticism about the prospects for peace at this point is leading a number of European governments to look at these alternative approaches.
Gentlemen, it has been a pleasure talking to all three of you. It really has. I'd like to thank you for your time and your thoughts. Yazid Saeed, Shibli Telhami, and Anthony Dworkin joining us on Inside Story. Thank you. And to you, our viewers, thank you for joining us. As always, you can leave your comments on our programs page at aljazeera.com. You can post your views to facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can tweet us as well at AJ Inside Story is the handle there. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.